Welcome to the What If podcast. Today I am joined by Dr. Murisa and Claire Nyamayaro. My name is Nontsikelelo. We are talking about Zimbabwe in the next 5 years. Claire, I'm going to start with you as a young person who's working at CVO, just to tell us about the current situation in Zimbabwe. What does Zimbabwe look like to you at the moment?
Thank you so much, Nancy. So the current situation in Zimbabwe is, I think it's a 50-50 type of situation, because you have a group, or rather a cohort of the youth that have lost hope. They have a dark cloud hanging on them, and they just feel leaving the country for maybe going to the Europe or outside the country is a better option for them to look for greener pastures. But you know what they say, the grass is greener where you actually water it. So we also have another group of people that have seen so much opportunities in the country. Recently, I was reading an article of a young gentleman who left the United Kingdom to come back to Zimbabwe to start his venture in the agricultural business. So I think it's a matter of a mindset where how do you visualize where you're at? How do you visualize you being in a country, and what opportunities can you actually make of the challenges that actually surround us? So it's, like I stated, it's a 50-50 situation where some have decided to leave and still working to leave the country, while some see greener pastures and a better future in the country, regardless of the challenges that surround it. So,
all right, so I'm just going to bring that back a little bit and talk about you personally. Sure. Well, how are you finding Zimbabwe? What are the challenges? You know, what are you finding difficult? And maybe let's also talk about the positive things. What are the good things that you're seeing in Zimbabwe?
Thank you, Nancy. I think, so I personally studied at the University of Witwatersrand. So the idea was, okay, I'm also going to be part of the students or the people that are leaving the country for greener pastures. But the moment I got there, I realized, you know what, sometimes it's best, like I stated, it's best to water your grass where you're at. So then when I came back, I started working at CVO Institute, which was a great opportunity for me. I've learned quite a lot over a small period that I have been at CVO Institute. It's just a matter of making the best out of the worst that is already present.
Dr. Murisa, I'm going to come to you. What is your experience of Zimbabwe? Where are we? And I'm sure there's definitely differences in age and our experiences will be different based on that. What would be priority to Claire and what she's not feeling or seeing in Zimbabwe? What is your take? What's your take on the current situation?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And Claire, thank you so much for your inputs. I'd like to come back at some point to talk about the youth, because they are the future of the country. So it'll be very interesting for us to just look at maybe in another episode around what the youth are going through, what needs to be done, what must we do. But for this kind of conversation, let me start off by saying I made the decision to come back to Zimbabwe. I left briefly. I've worked across Africa. I was based in Dakar, then a brief hiatus in the United States of America, then came back home. But by the time we came back home, we had made the decision that we're going to stay in Zimbabwe. So I think that's a very important thing, the decision, because in many instances, even for people like myself, if you have not made the decision, it's easy to pack up and go when things get bad. And things get bad in Zimbabwe, like other underdeveloped countries, etc. I think my advantage could be that of years, but also it is about exposure. After having worked across Africa, after having seen conditions in West Africa, East Africa, I always say that Zimbabwe is not as bad as we may think of. And when I say that, I daggers are drawn, because I think in the majority of instances, the comparisons I see between Zimbabwe and developed countries. There's quite a number of us who are living either in the UK, in the US, etc. So they will talk about the experiences there and compare with Zimbabwe. So I think at times that comparison is unfair. But when you begin to look at conditions across African countries, you begin to see similarities. There's so many things that Zimbabwe could have done better, but it hasn't. Zimbabwe slowed down, especially around infrastructure development. So we lagged behind many countries, including Tanzania, a country that I've seen change with my own eyes over years, where initially just traveling around Dar es Salaam was a nightmare. But they've been huge. It's a transformed country. So I think the period of what you may call the height of the crisis, the first decade of the 21st century, when we're going through land reforms, we lagged behind in terms of investing in public infrastructure. That's number one. But also what had happened the decade prior to that, in the 1990s, Zimbabwe had gone through structural adjustment program, which by all means was a bad policy. Government should not have embarked on structural adjustment programs, because what we did, we decimated our manufacturing base. We lost a lot of manufacturing jobs. So maybe for youngsters like yourselves, you may not know that Kadoma and Chegutu were our textile belt, but companies there have closed. In Chitungwiza, we had Corn Textiles that was employing close to 12,000 people, but it's also gone. So we, Melin Textiles in Blawayo, the same. So it was through ESAP that really the country began to collapse, because at that point, early 1990s, manufacturing was contributing close to 25% towards GDP. So that has been decimated. So our manufacturing base, and it's a factor of many things, and this is where we always say to people that when you look at it, when you try to open up through what they call the open general import license, where you're actually liberalizing and removing tariff-based barriers, and you're allowing imports from other countries, you're already competing with China. China was lending a towel or a pair of socks at less than $1 here. Melin Textiles could not match that. So we began to collapse our own companies by policies were put in place. So that is the beginning of Zimbabwe's crisis. Then there's a huge governance challenge, especially the politics of politicians. I always say there's the politics of politicians and the politics of citizens. The politics of politicians was highly intolerant of dissent. So we found that the emergence of the opposition party, while it was good on the marker of democracy, actually created a very antagonistic society, polarized society, and we did not move because we watched these politicians fight each other for close to 2 decades. There was no space for anyone else to say anything. Politicians were engaged in a survival battle, and that survival battle led to certain policies that did not help us. So for instance, while it's land reform, I'm a huge supporter of land reform. While this land reform was necessary, we went too far. We could have come to a place whereby we accommodated even the large-scale commercial farmers, because they were models. But because of the politics of land reform also merging with the politics of power of ruling the country, we ended up becoming very populist and ended up just destroying an otherwise productive sector. So on the one hand, you have destroyed your manufacturing sector through ESAP, then through land reform, you destroy your otherwise highly mechanized, sophisticated agricultural sector. In 2 decades, you have decimated the drivers of your economy because of bad policies, and some of them because of political decisions that you have to make. So post-2010, we are trying to recover, but we are recovering in a space whereby already there are measures that have been imposed. There are court cases that have been raised against you. We are failing to pay debt commitments, etc. So the crisis is deepening rather than we are recovering. So we may see like shoots of growth. We begin to see recovery in tobacco, recovery in maize production, recovery even in wheat. But it's not enough. That recovery is not enough because, number one, it is also not associated with the recovering of manufacturing, but also there are no lines of credit being opened up for Zimbabwe. So it goes back to Claire's issue. We're not creating enough jobs for our youths. So we've got 10 state universities and private universities, but we hardly create jobs for graduates coming from 1 university per year. So that's the real crisis that we face. So it's a crisis both of, I think, bad policies coming back to haunt us. Don't ignore what happened in the 90s. It happened, it was bad. Don't ignore the contribution of fast-track land reform program. It happened and we went too far. We could have still managed to get land back, but also managed to still, like now we're beginning to see a sobering up around land relations, and we're beginning to even see a welcoming back of former large-scale commercial farmers. So I think those are the issues around where we are as a country today. So as we were going through all these crises, these measures that we're putting in place, other countries were doing much better. Yeah, that's the real crisis of Zimbabwe. But for you to come back, you have to make a decision, understanding all these facts. That is not easy. Social services have collapsed in this country. Education is not what it used to be when I went to school. Health delivery is not what it used to be. Now you have to depend on private health providers. If you're going to depend on public health providers, you're actually putting your life on the line. So there's so many things that need fixing in our country. And some of us came with the hope. Maybe we put too much of ourselves in it to say we can also contribute, because it's actually a very difficult task. It's not easy to think that you can contribute to nation building when you don't belong to government, when you're outside, and you're actually struggling with some of the laws that actually constrain you. I run an NGO. That's what I started, a policy institute. But at the moment, again, the PVO law is back. So we're not so sure even about our survival, whether we're wanted in this country or not.
So I picked up two things from you, Claire and Doc, and one of them was mindset and the decision that I am staying in Zimbabwe, right? But in all of that, I don't know if mindset is enough and decision is enough for you to survive in Zimbabwe. I mean, you can make the decision to stay, but you're looking at prices going up. You're looking at maybe your inability to have a savings account. I am wanting to buy a car, maybe end of this year, or to buy a house. I would consider myself youth for the moment. So let's have a discussion on what conversations should we be having. We are facing these issues. We've spoken about mindset. We've spoken about making a decision. And then we're also looking at the reality of what is on the ground. What conversations should we be having to bring those three elements together?
Yeah, I think whatever conversation we're going to have, it should not be in isolation. Because half the time when I listen to colleagues, friends, family in Zimbabwe speak about their crisis, they make it look like it's isolated, that this is unique to Zimbabwe. I think we are facing a crisis, a global crisis around our civilization. It's a very interesting moment that there are images of homelessness coming out of Washington, Seattle, coming out of London, etc., where people are actually homeless. Yeah. So what we have is the global model of accumulation and production is at the core of the challenge that we face. Of course, here in Zimbabwe, we may have exacerbated it with wrong policy turns that we have taken. But I think we need to understand that if we look right now, the crisis in South Africa is failing to employ its own doctors. It's a real crisis that they can't create jobs. So I think by all means, let's have a conversation about what it means to stay in Zimbabwe. What are the challenges we're facing and how we can contribute to change. But let's not do it in isolation of what we are seeing. The hyperinflation that we're seeing, it is real, but we're not the only country dealing with inflation. Maybe ours is hyper, others is just inflation. But again, it affects that. But also, I think there are certain things that we underestimate about the advantages of staying in Zimbabwe. 90% of our transactions in Zimbabwe are now in US dollar terms. So I would risk that when you're talking about savings, you are saving in US dollar terms, in US dollars. And the majority have access. I was surprised. I'm trying to do a project in the rural areas. And when I was trying to negotiate for labor, the quotes were coming in US dollars. There was no talk of the local currency. So why am I talking about this? I think you stand a better chance when you begin to plan your life financially around the use of the United States dollar. And also the fact that the government has come up with a policy. We know that they may change their policy. But at the moment, they've said for the next 5 years, we're going to continue with the multi-currency regime. So we hope that stays. And if that's the case, then you have a 5-year horizon of planning around a more stable currency, etc. But again, many people will say, but it's not everyone who earns in US dollars. But many studies are being carried out that what we're beginning to see for those who are in the formal sector, they are being paid either a combination, RTGS and US dollars. Those in the formal sector do not sell anything in local currency. They sell in US dollars. So why am I saying this? I think Zimbabweans in Zimbabwe are better positioned, just to talk about savings, than their counterparts, say in Malawi, in Zambia, where currencies are also collapsing, or in Mozambique. But because in those environments or in those jurisdictions, they're having to save in their local currencies that are very vulnerable. Because the issue, really, the elephant in the room, is the vulnerability of African currencies. That's the challenge. It's very difficult to plan when your currency can lose value overnight. We see this with the South African rand, we see this with the Zambian kwacha, the Malawian kwacha is even worse. So there's drama around local currencies. But now, the multi-currency could be a place. I know officials or office holders would prefer that we use the local currency a bit more. But since it was reintroduced and where we are now, it has lost tremendous value. So for me, whenever I talk to people about currency, I always say that in the absence of currency reforms, I would urge people to save their money in United States dollars or South African rands.
I think you've put that very well. Claire, I'm coming to you. And what conversations do you think we should be having as youth for Zimbabwe in the next 5 years? What should we be talking about? You said you made the decision to come back home, and it's a 50-50 situation. Let's talk about the positive 50-50 and conversations around that.
Okay, I think the issue with the youth is, well, speaking on as a youth as well, we definitely know what we want as the youth. And sometimes it's probably an issue of us failing to have the podium to actually then address those issues. I think, let me just take you a little bit back. There was an initiative that was presented by President, where the youth had to gather at the Sheraton Hotel and have a conversation around maybe issues that affect them. But if we look at it, we have a larger population maybe of youths coming from Harare having a conversation. But what about conversations of issues that affect other youths from different parts of the country? So I think it's an issue of creating an inclusive landscape where it's not only a situation where voices are amplified, but where youth's voices and their active participation is also recognized and encouraged. So what conversations should we be then having or talking about? It's a matter of, because I think the major issue for most youths is issues around employment creation. How do we impact knowledge to the youth besides just around employment? Vocational training centers. I think we have also seen the students from the University of Zimbabwe, how they've taken initiative to respond to a national crisis, how they have taken initiative to also produce number plates a time when a country was going through a crisis. So I think these are some of, we definitely do have ideas of what we want to accomplish as the youth. But I guess it's just a matter of, do we have an inclusive landscape where we are involved economically, socially, politically, to then address these issues around employment creation, resuscitation of industries, where then we can become champions of or agents of knowledge around issues, around those issues of employment and all. So I think, yeah, like I stated, we definitely do have ideas and we know what we want to speak about, but do we have that inclusive landscape that enables us to actually have that conversation?
Lovely. So are you saying you're waiting as the youth to be given the platform, or is it possible for us to create, or for you to create a platform where you express your views?
Sure. So I think what Dr. Tendai has highlighted previously, we are probably still facing a challenge of working in silos, where one group or maybe a cohort in that particular area are doing tremendously well. But what about the other group in the other side or in the other district of the country that also have brilliant ideas, but they just don't know how to then come together and present that. So it's a matter of us knowing that we have a common enemy, but we need to come together and fight that. So I think it's just a matter of how do we then collaborate rather than just working in silos. And then we've had platforms where there's youth initiatives have been championed. But like I stated, we're still leaving others behind. How then do we also drag them to be part of the initiative, the movement that we're trying to champion for the voices that we're trying to amplify amongst the youth around the issues that definitely affect us on a daily. So it's a matter of finding those strings and putting them together and coming together as a one group and speaking in one voice. But I think the challenge is the loopholes, the gaps that still pre-exist, with then coming together and rallying. Because also sometimes we're like, the youth from maybe Matebelele, the youth from, but we are trying to eradicate all those names where we label youth from, because we are all youth, we are all Zimbabweans, and probably are facing similar challenges. But then how do we tackle them together in one group and in one accord and speaking in one voice?
Right, thank you, Claire. Dr. Murisa, I'll come to you. Let's talk about the future of Zimbabwe. What scenarios are you seeing, both good and bad? From where we are now, we just had elections last year, and we have 5 years to go until the next election. What are you seeing?
Yeah, well, so, okay, let me be serious. I was about to throw in a joke. So I think the World Bank has called it rightly in their report on Zimbabwe. They've said that Zimbabwe is at the crossroads. We can go the usual, they say you can do the business as usual path, where you just do what you've been doing, you don't pay attention to currency reforms, you don't pay attention to governance reforms, you don't take that seriously. You just do what you've been doing. One day you say this, tomorrow you say that, and you'll be satisfied with a growth rate of 2%, 2.5, 3% per annum until the next election. That's the business as usual approach. But then there's the business unusual approach, where, and I really agree with the World Bank because of Washington Consensus and our challenges and how they look at the world. But this time I'm tempted, I'm persuaded to agree with them. Because here then they map to say business unusual looks like this. Then they map, and this coincides, for instance, with something I've been reading. In 1980, the ZANU-PF manifesto talked about taking over the commanding heights of the economy. They were talking about manufacturing, mining, and agriculture, etc., etc. So 2024, the commanding heights of the economy remain the same. They're still those sectors. It has to be mining, agriculture, manufacturing, and maybe tourism. But for me, it's the first three. That's where we really need to concentrate. So the business unusual approach is to focus on those. And we really need to come up with coherent policies that are consistent, that are not changed overnight. So let me talk about agriculture. I think the first thing, and I'm glad that World Bank also agrees with some of our writings, the first thing that we need to fix is land tenure. There is lack of consistency around property rights. We took land in 2003, 2004. 20 years later, we've not fixed that. People who got land are holding it on the basis of offer letters. Permits have not been issued, leases have not been issued. So even the people on the land are not really secure. Because now and again, we pick in the media that so-and-so has been evicted from their farm. Because the offer letter gives unusual powers to the minister that he can evict you overnight from a farm you've been given. So we do not have security of tenure. And yet we're expecting agriculture to be the driver of economic growth. Agriculture in a highly capitalistic society where you need investments. Even banks are reluctant to participate in agricultural value chains because of that uncertainty around property rights. Because I can fly to South Africa right now and I can buy a piece of land and I'll have a title deed and I can start farming. But in Zimbabwe, that is not so. So we have done land reform. We have redistributed land. There could be other outstanding issues to do with multiple farm ownership, etc. But those who've been given land should now be given the right paperwork so that they can begin to leverage the land to gain funding either locally or internationally so that they can really participate. So agriculture is a no-brainer because everyone sees the skills in Zimbabwe and the kind of land resource we have and our climate. We are good for many things. We can contribute towards the global horticulture economy, the orchard economy, the flower economy, and even livestock. Small livestock, your sheep, your goats, etc. We can begin to sell to emerging economies, Dubai and other regions. They want those things. But we keep on talking about it as a potential because we're failing to resolve how we can marry agriculture to financial services. What is missing in tenure is tenure. So that needs to be fixed. And also talking about the youth, I think there are many opportunities, and we have to say this. If we look at Zimstat figures, the majority of our youths are based in rural areas. So I like it when Claire says we should not just talk about the youths as if they are all based in Harare. Zimbabwe is not Harare. So when we begin to think about the youths that are in the rural areas, we begin to say, besides also asking them to farm, what other roles can they play? Because they may not have access to land, which is understandable, especially in customary areas or even in fast-track areas. But what if we begin to think of them as hub players? They are the ones who maybe provide production support. They are the agro dealers. They're supported to establish agro dealer network shops, or they are the ones who are now playing the role of actually buying the produce and selling in the market. So there are many roles that the youth can play within the agriculture value chains with proper training and proper support. But the challenge is all these ideas are before office holders in government. There's nothing new that I'm saying. It's just the implementation. So if only we could implement 20 to 25% of ideas that have been made in the past 5 years, we can actually move the needle. So that's agriculture. Mining is also interesting. The World Bank suggests that we should have a lithium battery strategy. Totally agreed. Government has come up with the idea, has even stated that it will be held in some place, etc. We now need to see traction. Because the challenge really with metals, platinum, lithium, and many other minerals that we mine here, is we are subject to global prices. So we do not control the price of what we produce because we're sending them as raw materials, as in their raw form without value addition. But the moment you add value, you can set a price for your batteries. And honestly, it does not make sense for a country that is part of the top 5 of global producers of lithium, that there's no single battery being made in Zimbabwe. And we have no strategy around it. And we're not committing resources towards it. It speaks to the perpetuation of the colonial model of development, where Africa was assigned the role of producing raw materials only. So we really need to think in these 5 years to say, if we're going to tap into the benefits of mining, because I've heard this $12 billion goal, etc., I always ask to say, have we actually done the ownership? Because 12 billion, who's going to get the 12 billion? Are we saying that the 12 billion will come to government, or it's actually going to be to those who own mines? So if we do not flip that, and if we do not then even talk to the issues that Claire is raising about how can the youth participate in these value chains, again, there are other roles that the youths can play within the mining industry without necessarily becoming the miners. But if we really look at the value chain, we begin to say, how do we make sure this is done? I have my own issues with the big platinum miners in terms of what the World Bank has called local content. To what extent are they securing downstream products that they need for their production locally? Those could be moments or opportunities for affirmative action directed at youth entrepreneurs who begin to service mining companies. We laugh because some of these mining companies import even ballpoint pens from outside the country. So they are enclaves that are not creating an ecosystem of development around them. So we really need to be thinking about how does mining contribute to not only saying they've created jobs, but broader beyond creation of jobs. How are they actually creating value where they are? So in many instances, if you look at the infrastructure, the better road comes from their gate to the port. But the villages around have poor roads. So we really need a conversation around how to make sure that mining is contributing towards inclusive development. So manufacturing, there's a bit of work. But what I like about manufacturing is, thanks to China and other industrialized countries, technology has become more accessible and more affordable and also smaller. So where we used to have peanut butter produced by a big conglomerate in this country, you and me can set up a peanut butter making company overnight because the machinery is there, it's so easy, etc. So this is the things that we need to be thinking. How do we marry agriculture with manufacturing? Using affordable tech. Some of the technology is actually done here. We're adding value. Because the moment you add value, you have what we call price autonomy. Or you can now set prices determined by demand. But at the moment, if you're producing raw materials, it's the market itself that tells you that, oh, we are only buying groundnuts, so many groundnuts from Zimbabwe this year, and we'll buy at this price. You have no say over it. So if we do not really think about value addition, we are going nowhere fast.
Right. So, Doc, you've just given us an outline of the different things that industries can do to help us develop our country. And somewhat it gives me the sense that it'll have to come from the top. So I'll bring the conversation a bit lower to say, what can we do as individuals to contribute to the development of Zimbabwe in the next 5 years?
Yeah, you know what? It does not necessarily need to come from the top. Because if you look at economies that have emerged just prior to the transition into the 21st century, they're actually driven by what you may call small to medium scale enterprises. So I think we need to, the talk is entrepreneurship, I think. When you really think about it, is to say every economy that is doing well, the driver really is SMEs that employ 40, 50 people, 60 people, whatever. So the challenge with this government is does not take that sector seriously. It does not give it proper tax incentives, tax benefits, etc., etc. And at times we actually call it the informal sector. So I think it's a very chauvinistic thing. It has to do with the colonial mentality within government and other private sector players, I might as well say it. But the real issue is we need a coherent strategy around SMEs because I think they are the key drivers of economic growth in agriculture, in mining, and also in tourism. They are easier to manage. In a context where there's scarcity of funding, you rather have smaller to medium scale firms running that place. Because large scale firms are a bureaucracy. And normally what we've seen about large scale firms in Zimbabwe, they tend to be multinational in nature. We've got very few local large scale firms. The majority are actually international. And international firms tend also to externalize their profits. They don't spend their profits in Zimbabwe, which is global practice. There's nothing wrong with it. But for us, where we are, we need savings. We need resources. When you earn a profit, we need that reinvested in the economy. We need that reinvested either in construction, in other things, or then you move into another sector, etc. So if I were government, I would focus on developing a very dynamic SME sector where you actually make sure that they have priority in terms of funding, that there are certain sectors that are actually blocked for them. They actually begin to be prioritized around servicing the larger firms and even government. But the challenge we have, it's also a sector that is highly regulated because the allegations that there's corruption, there's smuggling, etc., happens in that sector. So I think there's need for a refresh around SMEs. And this is not only unique to Zimbabwe. Many countries fail to see this. Because if you really look at, say, who is employing people, it's SMEs. Yeah? In many instances, the studies that we've done surface this to say SMEs. And some SMEs are not necessarily registered the way you want them to be registered because they're trying to avoid paying these punitive taxes. So it's not that they can't register, it's actually a strategy of avoidance to say the moment we surface ourselves this way to government, the relationship is not about government giving us incentives, it's government taking from us. So we're yet to come to a place whereby there are actually incentives for setting up a business in Zimbabwe. We actually find that foreign investors are preferred more over local investors in this country. So foreign investors may have a tax code that gives them a tax holiday for 5 years, while our SMEs don't get a tax holiday. From day one you start producing, you get a tax number. That means you're now obligated to pay tax. So we really need to rethink how we're going to grow this economy, especially if we're talking about inclusive growth, because that's what we're passionate about, some of us, to say this growth that we are focusing on should just not be about producing 5 or 6 millionaires, but it should be producing about thousands of middle-class actors, those who own their homes, who are creating jobs, etc.
Right. So I'll come back to my question of what can we do as individuals? We've spoken about cooperatives, we've spoken about MSMEs. As individuals, what can we do? And while you're thinking about that, I'll just quickly go to Claire.
Sure.
Claire, what is your vision for the next 5 years for Zimbabwe? What do you want to see?
Okay, so I think as an individual, I think for the next 5 years, I want to see a generation of youths. We are a group of diamonds that have been created under pressure with a positive mindset that regardless of the challenges we're facing, regardless of the different circumstances that we're undergoing, there's still a brighter Zimbabwe that awaits us. We are the agents of change, and without us, there's no change that is going to take place. And like I stated, with a positive mindset. We cannot wait. Doc spoke about messianic approach. There's no one who's going to come and rescue us. We have to take initiative for these changes to happen. So I want to see a better youth actively involved in situations that affect us as the youth, taking the lead role in leading, and encouraging, having a positive mindset that radiates towards other individuals, towards other youth, to take initiative to make a better change for Zimbabwe. So I think that's the biggest thing, because everything else aligns when we have a positive mindset on how we can, head towards a better Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Claire. Doc, I'm coming back to you. I put that question on pause for a little bit. So let's come back to it. What can we do as individuals to contribute to the development of our country?
And this may sound biased because I'm Zimbabwean. I find Zimbabweans as the most resilient people I've ever come across. The conditions we have lived under, 2008 and other years, other nationalities may have crumbled, but Zimbabweans, for some reason, have this capacity to dig deep. So I always say that Zimbabweans are not necessarily entrepreneurs, but they are entrepreneurial. So not all of them are setting up businesses, but the way they live, it's very entrepreneurial. Because in the midst of this crisis, we've just been told, government had, as of last year, had actually opened up for this country to be able to import cement. And when you use economic indicators, it tells you something about what Zimbabweans are doing. Cement. The demand for cement tells you that there's a lot of construction going on. And if you travel on the highways and look at the cities, look at Harare, look at Kadoma, look at Gweru, look at Kwekwe, the construction that is happening across the highways tells you that this entrepreneurialism, that despite the crisis, despite the absence of mortgage financing, despite any loans, Zimbabweans are building homes. Zimbabweans are taking their kids to some of the most expensive schools. Not necessarily the elite private schools, but education in this country has become expensive. And many people with means are taking their kids to private schools, which are at different layers. So I think there's something about Zimbabwean energy that we are not tapping into appropriately. So challenges, at times, office holders in government make it look like we're at loggerheads. They do not see the synergies they can create if they worked with communities. That's the most important part, to begin to say, what kind of synergies can we create? So to your question, to say, what can we do? I would say we should not abandon the hope, and we should not abandon what we have been doing, because we've been surviving despite the crisis in government. That's one thing that we've done for the past 24 years, surviving despite the crisis. Unfair as it is, it looks like we're going to have to survive again despite the crisis. And we've got a drought ahead of us. And I make a bet that the Zimbabwean citizens will make a plan. Is making a plan right? Well, some people are saying, I'm tired of making a plan. But it just looks like that's our lot. We're just going to make a plan. But also, I think there's certain things that I expect to see in Zimbabwe. I think we are not adequately speaking truth to power. We are not adequately bringing those in office to accountability. So I'm hoping that we'll begin to see more formations that are, in a way, structured around that kind of conversation to say, government, your priorities are misaligned. So our studies have shown that there's a huge difference between what government thinks citizens want and what citizens actually want. So we're hoping that we may begin to see consensus building platforms. And that effort is not going to be done that all of a sudden colleagues in government will wake up and think, oh, it's time, let's go and consult. But it's us knocking on doors, us making a demand to say we need to realign government priorities. Because we're in the middle of a drought and government has embarked on this big infrastructure drive. I'm worried that by the time the hunger really hits, we'll have beautiful roads, but we'll not have food in our houses. So these are the issues to do with alignment. So we're hoping that, and that can't happen if citizens are not demanding. So I'm hoping that we'll see a bit more active engagement of citizen formations, speaking truth to their councillors, speaking truth to their MPs, speaking truth to the ministers and the president. That's very important in many ways. But in a way, I'm hoping that my prayer is that we may find each other in the conversations. In many instances, when we have done this, we've just fought each other. We've not invested in hearing each other. We speak over each other. We label each other. So when we speak outside of government, colleagues in government easily call us now agents of regime change, etc., which is unfortunate, because any country that is successful is a country that can listen to people that do not necessarily agree with them. But it looks like that we do not have that capacity as a country right now. We're quick to give each other labels. You are opposition, you are this. But we are at a moment of a civilizational crisis, and it requires all of us to put our heads together. So Zimbabweans have to come out of the shell and begin to speak to each other.
Thank you, Dr. Murisa. Thank you, Claire. From what we've gotten here today is we all have a role to play around developing the Zimbabwe we want to see, around developing the vision that we have for Zimbabwe, but we cannot do it without you. So if you'd like to be a part of this conversation, we have details that will be given at the end of this podcast. Tell us your view. What do you see for Zimbabwe in the next 5 years? We'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you so much for taking time to listen. Please feel free to rate and review us on iTunes. But if you have any comments or questions, please send them to my email, tendai.murisa@gmail.com, or hit us up on Twitter. My handle is @tmurisa. Thank you again.